Chapter 7, Love Through Doubt. Maya was more competent at disaster relief than Echo had expected, and that competence was making him feel useless in ways he hadn't anticipated. They had been working at the community center in District 7 for 3 hours, helping families displaced by the reality storm's aftermath. While the upper spiral towers had experienced the storm as a managed spiritual event, the lower districts had dealt with actual casualties, people overwhelmed by consciousness expansion without preparation, families whose children had spontaneous awakening experiences they couldn't understand, elderly residents whose untreated trauma had been triggered by the storm's psychological intensity. Maya moved through the crisis with the sort of practical grace that came from experience Echo realized he completely lacked. She knew which families needed medical attention versus psychological support, which children were acting out from fear versus genuine neurological disruption, how to organize supplies efficiently and create calm in chaotic spaces. Echo, meanwhile, had never folded a blanket for someone who didn't have a home to take it to. "You're thinking too hard," Maya said, not looking up from the medical supplies she was sorting. "It's just blankets. The goal is warmth, not perfection." Echo attempted to adjust his folding technique, but his hands seemed determined to create precise geometric patterns rather than functional bedding. "I'm not sure I'm helping." "You're here," said Carmen, the young mother whose family had been moved to the center after their apartment's consciousness-responsive systems had malfunctioned during the storm. "Yesterday, during the worst of it, I kept expecting someone from the Institute to come help, but nobody did until this morning, and then only to collect data on what had happened." Echo felt something uncomfortable settle in his chest. "They collect data?" "Oh yes," Carmen continued, settling her 2-year-old son on her lap while he played with a toy that was clearly handmade rather than purchased. "Very interested in how the storm affected people without proper consciousness infrastructure, but not so interested in helping us clean up or find temporary housing." Maya's expression was carefully neutral, but Echo caught the look she gave him. Not accusatory exactly, but certainly evaluative. "Carmen," Maya said gently, "this is Echo. He works at the Institute, but he's here on his own time, trying to understand how consciousness research affects actual communities." Carmen studied Echo with the sort of direct assessment that people developed when they couldn't afford to waste time on insincerity. "You want to understand? My son had what you'd probably call a spontaneous consciousness event during the storm. Started talking to people we couldn't see, describing colors that don't exist, drawing pictures of mathematical patterns he's never been taught." She showed Echo a drawing. Her son had made intricate geometric forms that looked remarkably like the consciousness topology maps Echo had seen in advanced institute research. Beautiful, right? Also terrifying when you don't know if your child is having a breakthrough or a breakdown, and the only people with expertise in consciousness development are 40 floors up in towers that don't take emergency calls from District 7. Echo stared at the drawing. The child had somehow intuited consciousness patterns that took institute researchers years of training to recognize. "What happened?" he asked. "During the storm, I mean." "We held him," Carmen said simply. "Me, my neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez. We just held him and told him he was safe and that whatever he was seeing was real and important. We didn't try to stop it or fix it. We just stayed present." "And that worked?" Carmen smiled. "He's fine. Different maybe. More sensitive to people's feelings, more interested in patterns and music, but fine." Her expression grew more serious. "But what if we hadn't known to hold him? What if we panicked or thought he was sick and tried to stop what was happening?" Echo realized he was witnessing something the Institute had never studied: community-based consciousness crisis intervention that was both instinctive and effective. "Maya," he said quietly, "how did they know what to do?" "Because consciousness crises aren't new down here," Maya replied, still sorting supplies. "People have been having awakening experiences and breakdowns and spiritual emergencies for generations. Communities learn how to hold space for that, how to support people through transformation without trying to control or pathologize it. But the Institute studies consciousness like it's a rare phenomenon that only happens under controlled conditions," Maya said, finally looking at him directly. "Down here we know consciousness is as natural as breathing. Sometimes breathing gets difficult and you need support, but you don't need experts to teach you how to breathe." Echo felt the familiar discomfort of having his worldview challenged, but this time it came with something else: a recognition that Maya's perspective wasn't just different from his, it was more grounded in actual experience with consciousness development across diverse populations. She wasn't just criticizing his work, she was offering him an education he couldn't get anywhere else. "Will you teach me?" he found himself asking. "Not consciousness development. I'm starting to think I need to unlearn a lot of what I think I know about that. But how to be actually useful in situations like this?" Maya paused in her work, studying him with the same careful assessment Carmen had used. "Teaching means I'd have to be honest about things you might not want to hear," she said. "About how consciousness research has affected communities like this one. About how people like you and Dr. Chen and the whole Institute apparatus look to people like Carmen." "I want to hear it," Echo said, though he wasn't sure that was entirely true. "Even if it means recognizing that your work, however well-intentioned, has been part of creating the inequality we're dealing with here." Echo looked around the community center at families displaced by a consciousness event that had been treated as a research opportunity rather than a humanitarian crisis, at children having profound awakening experiences without institutional support, at communities that had developed their own effective methods for consciousness crisis intervention while being excluded from formal research and resources. "Especially then," he said. Maya nodded slowly. "Okay, but we do this as equals, not as teacher and student. I learned from you too, about how institutional systems work, about research methodologies, about the perspective from inside consciousness academia. Deal?" "Deal." They worked in silence for a while, Echo gradually getting better at folding blankets while listening to Maya explain the community's informal networks for supporting consciousness development. How neighborhood elders who had experienced their own spiritual crises served as guides for others. How artists like her used creative practice as consciousness exploration and community healing. How families like Carmen's had developed traditions for supporting children through consciousness development that were more sophisticated than anything Echo had learned in his training. And how all of this happened without institutional oversight, technological assistance, or professional credentials. Maya, Echo said as they prepared to leave, in my impossible memories, the ones where I betray someone by choosing cosmic awakening over human presence, I think that someone was you. Maya was quiet for a long moment, watching Carmen's son draw another intricate pattern, while his mother sorted donated clothes. In my impossible memories, she said finally, I trusted someone who then used their spiritual insights to justify abandoning the communities that needed them most. Someone who chose individual transcendence over collective responsibility. They looked at each other across the space of folded blankets and sorted supplies, the weight of their shared impossible memories creating both recognition and apprehension. So, what do we do with that? Echo asked. We choose differently this time, Maya said. We use whatever understanding we're gaining to serve situations like this, instead of using situations like this to gain understanding. As they walked out of the community center together, Echo realized that falling in love with Maya would mean falling in love with a way of being in the world that challenged everything he thought he knew about consciousness, service, and his own role in systems that created the problems they claimed to solve. It would mean choosing love that included difficulty rather than love that transcended it. Love that grew through rather than despite their fundamental differences. Love that served communities like Carmen's rather than love that escaped into cosmic unity. The impossible memories had warned him about choosing transcendence over presence, but they hadn't warned him that choosing presence might be more challenging, more transformative, and more necessary than any transcendent experience he could imagine. I watched myself learning that authentic love requires staying present with differences rather than merging beyond them. In Echo's growing attraction to Maya's groundedness, I taste the recognition that spiritual development through relationship demands engagement with, rather than escape from the messy realities of systemic inequality and community responsibility. #reflection pause. Level 1. Immediate experience. Notice what it feels like to have your comfortable assumptions challenged by someone you care about. Does awareness itself resist this discomfort, or remain open to it? Level 2. Personal inquiry. What relationships in your life have grown stronger through working with differences rather than trying to transcend them? How has love been a teacher, rather than just a comfort?